The moment Eric's hands closed around her throat, Molly Reyes felt something inside her snap. Not a bone, not a sound, just the last thin thread of hope that he might stop someday. His drunken breathing was hot against her face as he hissed something she couldn't process. Her vision blurred at the edges. Her fingers clawed weakly at his wrists. Then instinct took over. She drove her knee forward with every ounce of strength she had left. It landed hard. Eric groaned, his grip loosening for just a second, but a second was all she needed. She tore away from him, stumbling backward, gasping for air that burned her lungs. Her throat pulsed with agony. She didn't think. She didn't look back. She snatched her bag from the floor, grabbed her jacket without even putting her arms through the sleeves, and ran. His voice exploded behind her as she bolted out the apartment door. "Molly, get back here!" It was the same voice she had heard so many times, angry, slurred, full of the kind of rage that never cooled. The hallway spun as she sprinted down the stairs, hands shaking so violently she almost slipped on the last step. She hit the lobby door with her shoulder and burst into the night. The cold October air slapped her across the face, but she barely felt it. Her legs kept moving, driven by terror rather than direction. She ran across the street without looking. A passing car hit a puddle, drenching her jeans with icy water, but the shock didn't slow her. She could still hear Eric's voice in her head. She knew how he got when he was drunk enough. She knew what he was capable of. A traffic light flicked red in front of her, glowing dimly through the blur of her tears. She paused, breath ragged, and dared to look over her shoulder. The door to their building stayed shut. No movement, no silhouette. For a heartbeat, she wondered if he had given up or gone back inside for another drink. But she knew better. Eric never let anything go. If he reached her again, if he got another chance, she wasn't sure she would survive it. The bus was already pulling up to the stop on the corner, old, dented, paint peeling from the sides, one of the late-night routes that only a handful of people used. The interior lights flickered as the driver leaned forward, clearly preparing to close the doors. "Wait!" Molly's voice cracked as she sprinted toward it, waving frantically. The driver, a middle-aged man with gray at his temples, hesitated, then reopened the doors with a tired sigh. Molly climbed aboard, chest heaving, her hands trembling so violently she almost dropped her bag. She muttered a breathless thank you and headed straight for the middle of the bus. Only when she sat down did the adrenaline begin to ebb, and with it came the pain. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened window, hair clinging to her face, mascara streaked, cheeks wet, and the bruise on her left cheekbone already deepening into a black-purple blotch. Her neck throbbed. When she touched it, she winced. Finger marks. She knew they would bloom darker overnight. For a moment, she pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her breath fogging the surface. She tried to steady her breathing, to think. But all she could feel was the echo of his hands and the weight of fear pressing down on her chest. The bus rumbled through the quiet Providence streets, streetlights smearing into golden streaks through her tears. She barely noticed the footsteps approaching until someone sat down beside her. The bus was nearly empty, rows and rows of open seats, and yet an elderly woman chose the seat next to her. Molly stiffened, startled, but the woman didn't speak. She simply looked at her. Really looked. Her eyes moved over the bruise on Molly's cheek, the red marks along her throat, the trembling in her fingers. Molly swallowed hard, suddenly self-conscious, wanting to hide but too exhausted to move. The woman didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask if Molly was okay. She didn't even introduce herself. When the bus slowed for the next stop, the woman stood, adjusted the strap of her worn handbag, and stepped toward the door. Then, just before she descended the steps, she turned her head and met Molly's eyes with a quiet, devastating certainty. "He will kill you." The doors hissed shut before Molly could move, before she could ask who the woman was, how she knew, or why those 3 words felt less like a warning and more like a fact. The bus pulled away, leaving Molly frozen in her seat, her fingers white around her bag, her heart pounding in terrified clarity. She had escaped tonight, but the danger was far from over. The bus rumbled through the quiet streets of Providence, its engine humming steadily as the city blurred past the windows. But for Molly, everything inside felt unbearably still. The old woman's warning echoed in her ears. Sharper than the cold metal of Eric's hands had been, she pressed her palms against her face, trying to stop the tears, but they broke through anyway, spilling hot across her cheeks. For a moment, she tried to convince herself she was safe simply because she was moving, because miles were slowly growing between her and the apartment. But safety wasn't a place she could get to, not anymore. The truth crept in slowly, then all at once. She had nowhere to go, no home that would take her in, no family close enough to reach before dawn, no friends who still knew her well enough to answer the door at this hour. Her parents came to mind first. They lived several hours away in upstate New York, far beyond what she could travel now. Even if she called them, even if someone picked up, Eric had worked for years to distance her from them. "You don't need to visit," he would say. "They don't like me, they judge you, they fill your head with ideas." At first, she believed he was just insecure. Later, she understood it was control. But by then, the calls home had become less frequent. Eventually, they stopped altogether. Molly wiped her eyes, trying to breathe. The bus jolted over a pothole, and she startled, instinctively pulling her jacket tighter around her body, as though it could shield her from the memories crowding in. She forced herself to think of her friends, old co-workers, college roommates, neighbors she used to invite for coffee. She went through the names one by one, like checking a list she already knew would come up empty. Eric had chipped away at each relationship. With one friend, he claimed she was a bad influence. With another, he accused her of flirting too much. With a third, he started fights until Molly felt too embarrassed to see them again. People drifted away. She retreated further, and Eric filled the space, becoming her entire world, the center of it and the walls around it. She closed her eyes, heart squeezing painfully. How had she let herself become this isolated? How had she not seen what was happening? The bus slowed for a red light, and Molly's gaze drifted to a row of storefronts passing by, places she had once visited, once enjoyed, once felt welcome in. She didn't even know if those people would remember her now. Her life had shrunk so quietly she barely noticed until there was nothing left of it. Nothing, and no one, except one name: Natalie. Molly's breath caught. Natalie Brooks had been her closest friend for years. Someone she trusted completely, someone who tried to warn her about Eric early on, and for that reason, Eric resented her. He called Natalie manipulative, jealous, toxic. He banned Molly from seeing her. The fights grew worse every time her name came up, until Molly finally stopped mentioning her altogether. It had been a long time since they'd spoken, too long. But Natalie had been the one person who never judged her, never demanded anything, and always cared. And right now, she might be the only person left. The decision settled into Molly's chest slowly, like an anchor dropping. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket, took a shaky breath, and reached for the stop request cord. The bell chimed faintly above her. As the bus rolled into Federal Hill, the night felt even colder, the air heavier with uncertainty. She stepped down onto the sidewalk, her legs weak from the adrenaline crash and the raw ache in her throat. The streetlights cast long shadows across the buildings, stretching toward her like reminders of all the ways the night could still go wrong. She hesitated. Maybe Natalie had moved. Maybe she wouldn't open the door. Maybe she'd forgotten Molly altogether. But Molly knew she couldn't turn back. She couldn't sit on another bus until morning. She couldn't wander the city hoping fear would keep her warm. She walked toward Natalie's old apartment building, each step slow, exhausted, unsure, but determined enough to keep moving through the dark. Tonight, she had nowhere else to go. By the time Molly reached the worn brick apartment building on Atwells Avenue, her legs felt like they no longer belonged to her. She climbed the steps slowly, gripping the railing to steady herself. The hallway light flickered as she made her way to the 3rd floor, each step sending a pulse of pain through her bruised throat. When she stopped in front of Natalie Brooks's door, her hands were shaking so violently she almost missed the doorbell. She pressed it again, weaker this time, praying Natalie still lived here, praying she would answer. The hallway seemed to hold its breath. Then the lock clicked. The door cracked open just enough for a face to appear, tired, wary, hair pulled into a messy bun. Natalie was holding a mug and wearing an oversized sweatshirt, clearly not expecting visitors. But the moment her eyes landed on Molly, the mug slipped from her hand and shattered on the entryway floor. "Oh my God, Molly!" Molly tried to speak, to smile, to explain, but the words never formed. Her knees buckled and she pitched forward. Natalie lunged and caught her before she hit the floor. Hey, I've got you," Natalie whispered, pulling her close. Molly buried her face against her friend's shoulder and sobbed so hard her whole body shook. Natalie wrapped both arms around her, steady and sure, holding her as if she were trying to shield her from the entire world. "You're safe. You're here now. It's okay. I've got you." Molly clutched her friend's sweater, unable to stop crying. Everything she had been holding in, the fear, the shame, the panic, broke open all at once. She cried until her throat burned and her breath came in ragged, hitching waves. Natalie didn't rush her, didn't pull away. She just held her. When Molly could finally stand again without collapsing, Natalie guided her inside and closed the door behind them. The apartment was warm, softly lit, and smelled faintly of vanilla candles. It felt like stepping into another universe. "Sit," Natalie said firmly, pulling a blanket off the back of the couch and wrapping it around Molly's shoulders. "I'm getting my first aid kit. Don't move." Molly nodded weakly. Her face stung when she touched her cheek. The bruise had darkened, spreading like spilled ink beneath her skin. Natalie returned within seconds, dropping to her knees in front of her. She studied the injuries quietly, too quietly. Her gaze moved from the imprint of fingers on Molly's neck to the swelling along her cheekbone. She didn't look shocked, just grave. "This wasn't a fall," Natalie said softly, pressing a cold pack against Molly's cheek. Molly swallowed hard. "No." "Okay," Natalie murmured, her tone calm but threaded with something sharper, a focused urgency Molly didn't yet understand. "Tell me what happened." Molly tried to start, but her voice cracked. Natalie placed a steady hand against her arm. "Take your time." So Molly inhaled shakily and told her everything. How Eric came home drunk again, how his anger escalated without warning, how he grabbed her throat and pressed until the room tilted sideways, how she escaped, ran barefoot down the stairs, caught the bus at the last second, and then the old woman. When Molly reached that part, Natalie paused mid-movement. She said, "He will kill you." "Just like that," Molly whispered, hugging the blanket closer. "She didn't even know me." Natalie exhaled slowly, sitting back on her heels. Her eyes weren't wide with disbelief. They were steady, knowing. Molly frowned. "You're not surprised?" "No," Natalie said quietly. "I'm not." She rose and sat beside Molly on the couch, keeping her voice gentle but unwavering. "I work at a women's crisis center, remember? I see this kind of thing every week. The bruises, the isolation, the escalation, the near misses, and the warnings. From neighbors, nurses, even strangers on a bus. People notice patterns victims don't always see." Molly stared at her, stunned. "You really think he would have—" "Molly." Natalie's voice didn't rise, but it didn't soften either. "From what you just told me, he already tried." The words struck like a physical blow. Molly's breath hitched, fear rising again, but Natalie reached out and took her hand, grounding her. "You did the right thing coming here," she said. "You're not alone tonight, and you are not going back to him. Not now, not ever." Molly's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't panic. It was relief so overwhelming she almost sobbed again. For the first time all night, she felt like she wasn't drowning. Natalie squeezed her hand. "We're going to figure this out, together." Natalie didn't turn on the overhead lights. She kept the apartment dim and warm, as if instinctively knowing that anything too bright or sudden might make Molly recoil. She guided her back to the couch, placed a soft blanket around her shoulders again, and sat beside her. "You need to understand something," Natalie began gently, but her tone carried the steady clarity of someone who had said these words to frightened women many times before. "What happened to you tonight? It's part of a pattern. It doesn't start with strangling. It escalates to it." Molly stared at the bruises on her own hands, her voice barely audible. "The woman on the bus. How did she know?" Natalie rested her elbows on her knees and clasped her hands together, thinking for a moment before answering. Because the signs are visible, especially to women who've lived through it or worked with survivors. In the U.S., strangulation is one of the biggest red flags in domestic violence cases. It's a predictor of future homicide. Most older women know that, either from experience or from watching people around them. Molly's stomach twisted. She hadn't wanted to hear the word homicide, not spoken so plainly, not connected to her. But Natalie didn't flinch. She wasn't trying to scare her. She was grounding her in reality. "That woman didn't need to know your name," Natalie continued softly. "She saw your neck, your face, your shaking hands, and she knew." Molly drew the blanket closer, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. She had spent years convincing herself Eric wasn't one of those men, and yet here she was, with bruises that told their own story. Natalie stood. "You're staying here tonight. No arguments. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Natalie cut in firmly. "You're safe here. That's what matters." She disappeared into the hallway and returned with bedding, fresh sheets, a thick comforter, and a pillow that smelled faintly of lavender detergent. She set everything up on the living room couch with calm, practiced movements, as if she had done this 100 times for other women who fled in the dead of night. Molly tried to help, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. Natalie gently lowered her back down. "I've got it." Once the couch was made, Natalie brewed chamomile tea and placed the warm mug between Molly's palms. The heat soothed her shaking a little, but not enough. Every distant car horn made her jump. Every sound from the hallway made her heart race. Even the hum of the refrigerator felt too sharp, too sudden. Natalie sat across from her, legs folded, watching her with steady compassion. "Listen to me," she said quietly. "Tomorrow morning, we're going to the ER. They'll document every bruise and injury. Photos, notes, everything. It's important evidence." Molly swallowed. "Do I have to?" "Yes," Natalie said, not harshly, but with unwavering certainty. "Hospitals in Rhode Island know how to handle domestic assault cases. They'll give you discharge papers with medical statements, and after that, we go to the police." A fresh wave of fear washed over Molly. "Eric will be furious." Natalie leaned forward. "I know. That's why we're also filing for a restraining order. The hospital documentation helps with that, too. And the sooner it's on file, the sooner the police can intervene if he tries to come near you again." Molly stared down at her tea, watching the steam fade. The words restraining order felt foreign, heavy. She never imagined her life would come to this. Medical records, police reports, legal protection. But Natalie spoke with such calm authority that some small part of Molly believed it might actually work. "I'll go with you to every step," Natalie added. "You're not doing any of this alone." Molly's eyes stung again. "Thank you." Natalie smiled sadly. "There's nothing to thank me for. I care about you. And you're alive tonight because you listened to your instincts. That's not weakness. That's strength." As the night dragged on, Natalie dimmed the lights even further and sat nearby, scrolling through resources on her phone. shelter numbers, legal aid contacts, crisis center staff she could call in the morning if needed. But she didn't leave the room. She stayed within sight, aware that Molly flinched every time she lost track of where someone was. Hours crept by. The clock ticked past 2, then 3. Molly lay curled under the comforter, but couldn't settle. Every creak from the building made her jolt upright. Every shadow sent her pulse racing. The bruise on her neck throbbed in time with her heartbeat. It wasn't until the first faint hint of dawn touched the window, pale gray light softening the darkness, that exhaustion finally overtook her. Her breathing evened out. Her fingers relaxed their grip on the blanket. But even in sleep, her body trembled. Natalie watched her with quiet determination. Tomorrow would be the battle. But tonight, at least, Molly had survived. The sun had barely risen when Natalie coaxed Molly awake. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her throat stiff, her body heavy with the weight of a night without rest. But the moment she remembered where she was and why, her stomach twisted with fear all over again. Natalie handed her a clean sweatshirt and soft leggings. "Change into these, then we go." The ride to Rhode Island Hospital was quiet except for the hum of the heater. Molly sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring out the window at the city slowly coming to life. Every time a car passed too close, she flinched. Every time her phone buzzed from inside her bag, missed calls, Eric. Her heart dropped into her stomach. Natalie didn't tell her to turn it off. She simply said, "We'll show everything to the police." Inside the ER, the triage nurse took one look at the bruises on Molly's neck and immediately called for a forensic nurse examiner, a FNE trained specifically for domestic and sexual assault cases. Molly didn't realize the significance until she saw the nurse's badge clipped to her collar. Forensic Nursing Program. They guided her into a private room with soft lighting and handed her a warm blanket. The forensic nurse, a calm woman in her 40s named Stephanie, introduced herself gently. "I'm here to document your injuries for both your medical care and any legal actions you decide to take. You're in control of this process. I'll explain everything before I do it." Molly nodded, but her voice wouldn't come. Natalie sat near her, never interrupting, never leaving. Stephanie began with a medical exam, checking Molly's breathing, swelling in her throat, the tenderness along her jaw, the bruising beneath her collarbone. Then she brought out a camera. "These photographs will go into your confidential forensic record. The police will request them as evidence with your permission." Molly swallowed hard as the flash illuminated her injuries. Each click of the shutter felt like a strange validation. Proof that what happened to her wasn't exaggerated or imagined. It was real, visible, documented. Stephanie asked questions one by one. "Has he ever hit you before?" Molly nodded. "Has the violence escalated over time?" "Yes." "Had he strangled you before last night?" A long pause. "He put his hands on my neck once, but not like this." Stephanie scribbled notes with quiet precision. "Non-fatal strangulation is extremely serious. I'm glad you came in." The words echoed Natalie's warnings from the night before. By the time the exam ended, Molly had discharge papers, medical documentation, forensic photographs, and a resource sheet for domestic violence survivors. She clutched the folder to her chest like a life vest. "Take these to the police," Stephanie said, "and don't go home under any circumstances. Not today. Not until the order is filed." Natalie squeezed Molly's shoulder. "We're going right now." The Providence Police Department was brisk, cold, and efficient. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they were directed to a small interview room. An officer with kind eyes and a clipped Rhode Island accent introduced himself as Officer Mendez. He waited until Molly sat down before beginning. "Tell me what happened." It took several minutes for her voice to steady enough to speak. Natalie sat beside her, silent support. Molly told everything, from the first time Eric yelled at her, to the jealousy, to the isolation from friends and family, to the controlling behavior, to the nights he came home drunk and violent. When she described last night's strangling attempt, Mendez's expression hardened. "And you fled the apartment immediately?" "Yes." "Did he pursue you?" "He yelled after me." "I don't know if he followed. I just ran." "And you have injuries?" She lifted her hair to show the bruising along her neck. Mendez inhaled sharply. "That's enough for a criminal complaint." His seriousness startled her. "People die from what he did," he said plainly. "You did the right thing coming here." For the first time in years, Molly felt heard, not dismissed, not doubted, not blamed. The officers helped her complete a formal domestic violence report. They filled out paperwork for an emergency protective order, explaining how a judge would review it that same day. They asked for Eric's full name, address, employer, and any weapons he kept in the apartment. Molly answered every question, her hands shaking but her voice growing steadier. When it was over, Officer Mendez handed her a printed copy of the report. "We'll attempt contact with him today. If he shows up anywhere near you or Natalie, call 911 immediately. You're under police protection now." Molly stared at the paper. It felt heavier than everything she had carried out of Eric's apartment the night before. But it was a different kind of weight, one that came with the first real steps toward freedom. She exhaled shakily, and for the first time, the air didn't burn. Natalie stood beside her, eyes soft. "See? You're not alone in this. Not anymore." Molly hugged the paperwork to her chest. She wasn't safe yet, but she was finally being believed. After leaving the police station, Natalie didn't ask Molly if she was ready for the next step. She simply said, "We're going to the center," in a calm, certain voice that somehow made the path forward feel less impossible. The Women's Crisis Resource Center sat in a converted brownstone near downtown Providence, warm, bright, intentionally inviting. Inside, sunlight filtered through wide windows, and the walls were decorated with soft colors and hand-painted murals by survivors. The space felt nothing like a clinic or office. It felt like a shelter of air where no one raised their voice. A receptionist greeted Natalie by name, her tone gentle the moment she saw Molly's bruises. She led them to a small room furnished with comfortable chairs and a basket of blankets in the corner. Molly sat down slowly, unsure where to place her hands, unsure how to exist in a place built for women like her. Two counselors entered, one younger, one older, both with the steady presence of people who had seen too much and still chose to do this work. They introduced themselves softly and asked Molly if she wanted tea or water. She shook her head no, unable to take in anything more. Natalie sat beside her but didn't speak. She knew this part of the process wasn't hers to lead. The older counselor began gently. "We're going to explain a few things, not to overwhelm you, but to help you understand what's happening inside your body and your mind. What you're feeling makes sense." Molly swallowed hard, keeping her gaze fixed on her own hands. The counselor continued, "First, you're shaking. That's a trauma response. When someone survives strangulation or any near-fatal assault, the nervous system goes into overdrive. Sleep becomes difficult. Loud sounds feel threatening. Your body stays alert even when you're safe." Molly felt her eyes sting. No one had ever explained her reactions to her, not even herself. "Second," the younger counselor added, "the isolation you described. Abusers cut off friends and family to increase dependency. You didn't drift away from people. You were pushed." Molly's breath hitched, the truth settling with painful clarity. "Third," the older counselor said gently, "financial control. You mentioned Eric handled the accounts, the rent payments, the budgeting. That's common. Financial dependence is one of the strongest traps in domestic violence, but it can be undone. We'll work through that with you." Molly tightened her grip on the blanket over her lap. The idea of rebuilding her life, money, housing, work, felt too big, too heavy. She didn't know where she belonged anymore. The younger counselor leaned forward, her tone grounding. "You're overwhelmed because everything hit at once. But let me be very clear. You have options, real options. And the fact that you came here today is huge. You survived what many women never get the chance to walk away from. Natalie exhaled slowly, as if she'd been waiting for Molly to hear those words from someone besides her. The counselors helped Molly schedule an intake appointment with a trauma-informed therapist who specialized in survivors of intimate partner violence. They explained that therapy wasn't about reliving the trauma. It was about rewiring the parts of her brain that had been trained to fear her own existence. After that, they walked Molly through the practical steps. How to apply for emergency housing if she couldn't go back to Natalie's long term. How to get a new phone number if Eric kept calling. How to freeze joint accounts temporarily. How the protective order would be served. How to build a safety plan for the coming weeks. Each piece was overwhelming, but the counselors spoke with patience, pausing whenever Molly looked too lost to continue. "We'll go at your pace," they said. "You don't have to figure everything out today." When the appointment ended, Molly stepped into the hallway with a small stack of pamphlets, a counseling schedule, and a binder of resources. Her hands still trembled, her throat still ached, the bruises still pulsed, but something inside her felt different. Not healed, not strong, not fearless, just possible. Escape was possible. A future without Eric was possible. A life in Providence, on her own terms, was possible. Natalie placed a hand on her back as they walked toward the exit. "You're doing incredibly well," she said quietly. For the first time, Molly almost believed her. By early evening, Natalie's apartment felt dim and quiet, the warmth of the morning fading into a heavy stillness. Molly lay curled on the couch beneath the lavender-scented blanket, her body exhausted but her mind too loud to let her rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt Eric's hands on her throat. Every creak in the hallway made her heart slam against her ribs. Natalie tried to keep the atmosphere calm, lights low, tea warm, soft music playing from her phone, but nothing stilled the tremor in Molly's hands. When Natalie turned on the TV, it was only for background noise. She flipped to a local channel, letting the familiar drone of an evening newscast fill the room. Molly wasn't paying attention at first. She stared at the ceiling, counting her breaths like the counselor had taught her. But then a quick, sharp sentence cut through the room. "Breaking news out of Providence tonight. Police have responded to a violent assault in the Elmwood neighborhood." Natalie froze with the remote still in her hand. Molly slowly sat up, drawn by the tightness in the anchor's voice. The screen showed a dimly lit apartment building, police tape strung across the entrance, flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the brick. Officers moved in and out of the frame. A stretcher appeared, paramedics clustering around it. Molly's pulse surged. The anchor continued. "Sources say a woman was attacked inside her apartment by an intoxicated intruder. She sustained severe injuries and is currently in critical condition at Rhode Island Hospital." The screen switched to a blurred mugshot. Molly's breath caught. The outline, the jaw, the hair. Even distorted, she knew immediately. Eric. Her stomach dropped so suddenly she had to grip the blanket to steady herself. Natalie's eyes widened in horror, not at Eric's arrest, but at the way Molly's face drained of color. They're saying he broke into a woman's apartment," Molly whispered, her voice barely there. "Natalie, he didn't find me at home, so he—" "No." Natalie cut in immediately, firm as stone, but Molly couldn't stop. The guilt, sharper than the bruises, tore through her. "He was looking for me. He must have thought she was me, or, God, what if—" "Molly, stop." Natalie's voice rose, not in anger, but in urgency. She grabbed Molly's shoulders, grounding her. "This is not your fault. What he did to that woman has nothing to do with you." Molly shook her head violently. If you had been home, you might be dead." Natalie's words were blunt, and she didn't apologize for them. "Eric didn't attack someone tonight because of you. He attacked her because that's who he is. Violent, uncontrolled, dangerous. The news anchor's voice droned on in the background, describing the woman's injuries. Molly pressed her hands to her mouth, her breath trembling. She could see her own apartment in her mind, the door she slammed behind her, the hallway she ran through, the footsteps she imagined behind her. She could see Eric stumbling drunk, enraged, looking for someone to hurt. If she hadn't left that night, if she hadn't gotten on the bus, if she hadn't escaped his grip, the blurred photo on the screen could have been her. The stretcher could have been hers. The critical condition update could have been about her body lying in the ER instead of giving a statement. The realization crashed over her like a wave of ice. "I should have told someone sooner," she whispered. "I should have gotten help earlier. Maybe none of this would have..." Natalie knelt beside her and took her trembling hands. "You did the best you could while living in fear. You survived. You came forward. That woman, she was hurt because of him, his choices, his violence, his actions." Molly's vision blurred with fresh tears. "It feels like it's my fault." "That feeling," Natalie said softly, "is part of the trauma. Victims blame themselves because it's easier than accepting how little control they had. But listen to me carefully. This guilt doesn't belong to you. Every bruise, every broken thing, every act of violence he committed belongs solely to him." Molly lowered her head, sobs shaking through her again. But these tears were different. They weren't grief for Eric or fear for herself. They were the crushing weight of understanding just how narrowly she had escaped. Natalie held her until the shaking eased, whispering the same truth over and over like a lifeline. "You are not responsible for what he did. You are only responsible for surviving." As the news anchor moved on to other stories, the room fell quiet again. But for Molly, the silence was no longer empty. It was the terrifying, undeniable space where she realized the truth. It could have been her, and it almost was. The next morning arrived colder than the last, with a gray sky hanging low over Providence. Molly barely slept. The news report replayed in her mind again and again, the blurred mugshot, the stretcher, the apartment building cordoned off by police tape. She felt wrung out, hollow, suspended somewhere between relief and dread. But overshadowing all of it was the memory of the elderly woman on the bus. Her voice, those 3 words, "He will kill you." They haunted Molly with a strange mix of terror and gratitude. The woman had seen her, truly seen her, in a way almost no one had. And now, after everything that happened, Molly couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to find her, not for answers, not even for closure, but because that warning had been the first thing to pierce the fog of denial she'd been living in. She waited until Natalie was at work before slipping on her jacket, pulling up her hood, and heading to the bus stop. The October wind bit at her still healing bruises, but she barely noticed. She retraced her steps to the exact route she had taken the night she fled, Route 27, the late-night line that ran through Federal Hill and up toward the northern neighborhoods of the city. A bus pulled up with a soft hiss, and Molly climbed aboard, gripping the handrail as if it might steady her racing thoughts. The driver glanced up. Not the same man from that night. Still, she approached him. "Hi, I'm looking for someone who might ride this line. An older woman, maybe late 70s or early 80s. Small, gray hair, very sharp eyes." The driver leaned back slightly, considering. "This route's got a lot of regulars. Let me think." Molly waited, her pulse tapping nervously at her throat. Finally, he nodded. "I think I know who you're talking about. She rides a few days a week, usually gets on near Hartford Avenue and off around Elmhurst." Molly's breath caught. Elmhurst. She didn't know why the name sent a strange shiver through her. Fear, anticipation, something else. But her chest tightened all the same. "Does she always ride at night?" Molly asked. "Not always. Sometimes afternoons, sometimes early evenings. Independent lady, keeps to herself." Molly thanked him and stepped off at the next stop, her heart pounding. Elmhurst wasn't far, a quiet neighborhood north of downtown, mostly old homes, small apartment buildings, and pockets of trees that still held onto their last October leaves. She'd been near there once or twice before, but now the streets felt different, as though carrying a faint thread that tugged her forward. She walked along the cracked sidewalks, scanning every passerby, every porch, every bus stop bench. She didn't know what she would say if she found the woman. "Thank you? How did you know? Why me?" Or maybe she only needed to see her again to feel grounded, to know her survival wasn't just chance. It was connected somehow, woven into something bigger she didn't yet understand. At a small corner store, she bought a bottle of water and asked the clerk if he knew an older woman who rode Route 27 regularly. He shook his head, then called to another customer. That customer shrugged. Molly thanked them and stepped back out. Pulling her jacket tighter, hours passed. She rode Route 27 once more, circled back through Elmhurst, then walked past small houses with porch lights glowing faintly against the early dusk. Her legs ached. Her bruises throbbed, her breath frosted in the cold, but she kept going, because the woman's warning had saved her life. And something inside her told her she wasn't done with this woman, not yet. As twilight deepened, Molly paused at a bus stop bench, rubbing her hands together for warmth. A Route 27 bus approached in the distance, headlights cutting through the blue-gray evening. She stood slowly, her heart climbing into her throat. Maybe this time. Maybe she would be on this bus. Maybe tonight the thread would lead her to the woman who saw her truth before she was brave enough to speak it. Hope and fear twisted together as the bus sighed to a stop. Molly stepped forward. The third time Molly rode Route 27, she felt something shift. Not certainty, she didn't have anything close to that, but a quiet pull in her chest, an instinct she couldn't explain. She got off near the Elmhurst neighborhood again, following the soft map the bus driver had sketched in her mind. Older homes, small porches, narrow streets, a woman who keeps to herself. This part of Providence felt older than the rest. Tall oaks lining the sidewalks, weathered fences, porch lights casting amber halos on early evening leaves. Molly walked slowly, scanning every small wooden house. Her breath fogged in front of her, the cold catching the fading bruise on her jaw. She questioned herself with every step. What if she was wrong? What if the woman didn't want to be found? What if this was all some misguided attempt at closure? But then she turned a corner and stopped. A small blue house sat at the end of the street, its paint chipped, its porch lit by a single warm bulb. The curtains in the front window twitched slightly, as if someone inside had been watching her approach. Molly hesitated, then climbed the porch steps. She raised her hand to knock, but before she touched the door, it opened. The elderly woman from the bus stood there. Her silver hair was tied back neatly, her frame small but steady, her eyes sharp and kind all at once. She didn't look surprised. She looked like she had been expecting her. "You came," the woman said softly. Molly's breath faltered. You remember me." "I don't forget faces carved by fear," the woman replied. "Come in, dear." Her voice carried no judgment, only recognition. Inside, the house was warm, filled with the quiet smells of chamomile and old books. Framed photos lined the walls, smiling women, groups gathered at what looked like community events, certificates from various organizations, a knitted blanket draped over an armchair. Everything felt lived in, gentle. The woman motioned to the couch. "Sit down, sweetheart. I'm Margaret O'Connell." Molly sat carefully, hands twisting in her lap. She didn't know where to start, didn't know how to thank someone who had saved her life with 3 words. Molly began, but her voice cracked. "I've been trying to find you for days. I didn't know your name. I didn't know if you would even talk to me. But I needed to know how you knew I was in danger." Margaret pulled a chair closer and sat across from her, her expression softening in a way that made Molly's chest tighten. "I knew," she said gently, because I've spent more than 40 years helping women escape men like the one who hurt you. Molly blinked, stunned. I was a counselor, Margaret continued. First at a women's shelter, then at a crisis hotline, later at a domestic violence center here in Providence. I retired years ago, but it never really leaves you. You learn things, patterns, signs, signals the body gives off long before the mind accepts what's happening. She reached out and took Molly's trembling hand. When you walked onto that bus, Margaret said quietly, your posture told me everything. The way you kept your arms tucked in close, the way your feet angled toward the exit as if you were ready to run again, and then your injuries, your cheekbone, your neck, bruises shaped by fingers, not accidents. Molly swallowed hard, tears blurring her vision. Women who have been strangled, Margaret said, carry a look in their eyes. It's a mix of shock and survival. I've seen it hundreds of times. It's the look of someone who knows she almost didn't make it. Molly pressed a hand to her mouth as a sob escaped. Margaret moved to sit beside her. And when I said those words, I didn't say them to frighten you. I said them because it was true. He would have killed you. Not because of anything you did, but because violence escalates. It always escalates. Tears rolled down Molly's cheeks, and Margaret wrapped an arm around her shoulders, guiding her gently until her head rested against the older woman's shoulder. You were not responsible for his actions, Margaret whispered. You did not provoke them. You did not deserve them. You did not cause them. Molly shook, tears soaking into Margaret's sweater. It feels like I should have seen it sooner. That's the lie abusers teach, Margaret said. They train you to rewrite reality, to minimize danger, to believe you're overreacting, even when your life is on the line. She stood and retrieved a small stack of materials from a bookshelf, pamphlets, trauma recovery guides, a list of crisis therapists. She set them gently in Molly's hands. These are not just resources, Margaret said. They are reminders that you're not alone. And this, she held out a small white card, is my personal number. Call me if the nights get too long, or if you forget your strength, or if fear tries to rewrite the truth again. Molly clutched the card to her chest, overwhelmed by gratitude, by grief, by the strange comfort of being truly understood. For the first time, she felt something inside her loosen, not fully, not permanently, but enough to breathe. Margaret placed a hand over hers. You survived, dear, and now you get to rebuild. When Molly stepped out of Margaret O'Connell's home, the late afternoon air felt different. Colder, yes, and sharp enough to sting her healing bruises, but clearer somehow, as if the world had shifted a fraction to the right, aligning her with a path she hadn't realized she was allowed to walk. She wrapped her jacket tighter around herself and started down the quiet Elmhurst sidewalk. Margaret's card tucked in her pocket and a small stack of resources pressed against her chest. She didn't feel cured. She didn't feel strong, but she felt steady. For the first time since running from her apartment, her legs moved without trembling. Natalie picked her up a few blocks away. She didn't ask where Molly had been, not yet. She simply looked at her friend's face and saw the shift, small but unmistakable. You found her, Natalie said quietly. Molly nodded. Her name is Margaret. Natalie didn't press. Instead, she reached over and squeezed Molly's hand, understanding instinctively that whatever had happened inside that little blue house was something sacred, something that didn't need to be dissected right away. When they returned to Natalie's apartment, the living room was dim with the yellow glow of a single lamp. Molly set the pamphlets on the table and sank into the couch, exhaling for what felt like the first real breath she'd taken all day. Natalie hesitated before sitting beside her. There's something I need to tell you, she said gently. I got a call from one of the officers at the station. Molly tensed automatically. Eric has been officially charged, Natalie continued. Felony assault. The woman he attacked, she survived. She's in critical condition, but alive. Molly closed her eyes as the weight of the news sank in. A mix of emotions washed through her: relief, sorrow, rage, guilt. But none of them swallowed her whole this time. Instead, they settled into distinct corners of her mind, each one painful but no longer drowning her. Is she... Molly's voice cracked. Is she going to make it? They think so, Natalie said. It'll be a long road, but she has family with her. Molly nodded slowly, staring at the blanket draped across her lap. I keep thinking, that should have been me. Natalie didn't correct her softly this time. She corrected her firmly. No, it could have been you, but it wasn't, and that is not a burden you're required to carry. Molly swallowed. The guilt didn't evaporate. It probably wouldn't for a long time, but something inside her settled at Natalie's words. She wasn't responsible. She had been a target, not a cause. For the next hour, they sat together in quiet companionship. Natalie drafted a list of the next steps: court dates, meetings with victim advocates, continued communication with detectives. Molly scheduled her first formal therapy session for the following week. The counselors from the crisis center had already sent her intake paperwork and a safety plan template. Molly followed every instruction, not out of obligation or fear, but because it felt like choosing herself, piece by fragile piece. As evening deepened, she walked to the small balcony outside Natalie's apartment. The city buzzed faintly below, distant traffic, murmuring voices, the rhythmic rustle of wind in the street trees. Providence felt different tonight, not exactly safer, but less threatening, as if the city itself had stepped out of the shadows with her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, an unknown number. For a moment, she froze, dread prickling the back of her neck, but when she answered, a gentle voice greeted her. Molly, it's Margaret. Molly's shoulders relaxed instantly. Hi. I wanted to make sure you got home all right, Margaret said. The first few nights are the hardest. The quiet can feel heavy. Don't let it turn into fear. A lump formed in Molly's throat. Thank you for everything. You don't owe me thanks, Margaret replied. Just keep going. Healing isn't a straight line, but each step forward counts. After they hung up, Molly stayed on the balcony a while longer, watching the lights flicker across the skyline. She touched the bruises on her neck, still tender, still dark, but no longer defining her. She wasn't healed, not yet. Maybe not for months, maybe not fully ever. But she was alive, she was safe, she was believed, and she was no longer alone. Later that night, as she settled onto the couch with a thicker blanket and the faint scent of chamomile lingering in the air, she whispered a truth into the quiet. I get to start over. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was grounded, steady, real. A beginning born from survival. Not perfect, not complete, but hers. And for the first time, that was enough.